Right, welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Stuck. I'm one of the four people involved in Walk, Listen, Create. We're a social enterprise, a not-for-profit. In the background, you might be hearing my grandfather clock. That's always slightly slow, 230 years old, and isn't quite keeping the right time, but nearly. Okay, so Walk, Listen, Create supports artists, performers, creators, writers who make work around walking or to be experienced on walking or writing about walking. And I know it's hard to believe, I'm having to pinch myself, but this is the 40th Walking Writers Salon that we've run. And if you want to catch up on any of them, you can find those in our video archive. Practically all of them have been recorded, but I managed to have a slip up on a couple and failed to press the record button. So that wasn't so clever on my part. Okay, so what we're going to do, as I've just mentioned, is we're going to have a discussion with Adam. He's going to read a little from his book. We're going to invite you to ask questions. And then we have a humdinger, a fiendish multiple choice quiz right at the end with 2 ebooks, which are being offered by Adam's publisher, which is Hutchinson Heinemann, which strangely enough is part of Random House Penguin, and publishers have been gobbled up over the last few years. So I've quite no idea who his publisher is, but it's pretty much described as Penguin, I think. So I'm going to introduce Adam. Adam is a writer and journalist. He's living on the southeast coast of England. He works for a wide variety of newspapers and magazines, including The Guardian, the BBC, The Atlantic, and Granta. Now, his first book, Kings of the Yukon, tells the story of a 5-month canoe trip across Alaska. I mean, my canoe trips are a couple of hours, so hats off to you there, Adam. Examining the decline of the king salmon and how that decline is impacting on the many communities and the ecosystems which depend on it. The book won the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year, the Lonely Planet Stanford's Adventure Travel Book of the Year, and the Prix Paul Emile Victor, as well as being shortlisted for the Ondaatje Prize. And his new book, which we're discussing today, Lone Wolf, follows 1,000 miles in the footsteps of a wolf who crossed the Alps to become the first wolf back in the Italian Alps for more than 100 years. The book itself was shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize for Best Nonfiction. That's the kind of booker for nonfiction. And Lone Wolf, sorry, I beg your pardon. And Adam has been named by the National Centre for Writing as one of 10 writers shaping the UK's future. Well, it's a bit of a tall order for me to start. Where does one start with that? So what I'm going to start with is, what was the initial prompt and what's been your continuing fascination around wolves?
Evening, everyone. Thanks, Andrew, for having me, and thanks for the introduction. It's always hard to know sort of where stories begin, isn't it? But if I had to put a place where I first got sort of really interested in wolves and wolves in Europe, it was probably coming back from Alaska. I spent about 5 years in Alaska, off and on, researching the last book. And when I finally finished my time there, I missed it with the acuteness of a homesickness. And at the time, I was living out on the west coast in Scotland on Loch Fyne. And if you squinted, you could almost convince yourself you were back in Alaska. You know, it was a kind of microcosm of the Alaskan landscape that I got used to, and the sort of the self-sufficiency and that kind of anarchic spirit were there in the people as well. But what I realized was missing, what I'd got used to seeing in Alaska, were all these big mammals. The bear, the lynx, the walrus, and the wolf. And I started wondering what had happened to those big carnivores that used to be just as common here as I'd got used to seeing them in Alaska. And the more that I looked, I realized that there wasn't, in fact, Alaska, as in so many ways, is the anomaly. It's the outlier, and actually large carnivores have suffered all across their range. And the wolf, which we've always found the hardest animal to love, has suffered more than any of the others.
Well, you sort of brilliantly brought in one of my questions further down the line, which was I was going to ask is why has the wolf developed such a grim reputation?
It's hard to know, and it's been there for so long that it feels quite instinctive now. But if you go back, and again, I saw this in Alaska because traditionally most indigenous people in Alaska are hunter-gatherers, and hunters have a very different relationship to the wolf. There was one Tlingit man that I met in Dawson who told me that the wolf was the doctor of all animals. They have this very strong respect for the wolf. It's kind of, one hunter speaking to another. But there was something about when we switched away from that hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a farming lifestyle, when we put up fences and had livestock, we suddenly had something that was on the inside of the fence that the wolf wanted. And very quickly, our relationship with the wolf flipped from being this sort of complex compatriot to the thief and the hound of the devil and all the pejorative terms that we've come up with it since. And there's been a bounty on wolves' heads almost since currencies existed to pay the bounty. You can trace it sort of right back to kind of ancient Greece. You could get a bounty for wolves. France set up the Louvre Corps in 827. Charlemagne set it up. It took them more than 1,000 years to get rid of wolves from France. But really, by the sort of mid 20th century, apart from a few isolated pockets in Alaska, bits of Russia, wolves have been almost entirely eradicated. They used to be the most widespread mammal, not non-domesticated widespread mammal on the planet, land mammal. And by the mid 20th century, we pushed them to extinction across almost their entire range, which was, and the more that I looked into those stories, there was something in the persecution that we enacted on them that felt to me like it bordered very much on hatred in a way. It wasn't just a kind of practicality to protect our livestock. There felt like there's a kind of different drive going on there as well that I was fascinated by the kind of vitriol that we had.
Yeah, because was one of my questions, of course, is what was your intention in undertaking the adventure, but also, did you start out as someone wanting to convince or be reassured that the wolf introductions that are going on, or the natural one that occurred that you followed, were a good thing? Was that your intention at the beginning?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's worth saying that. So nowhere they're doing very well in Europe now. Nowhere in Europe have they been reintroduced. There is the famous example of them being reintroduced into Yellowstone, and there's been other wolf reintroductions in Colorado and other places in the States, but nowhere in Europe have they been reintroduced. There's obviously been a lot of conversation about whether it's a good idea to reintroduce them to Scotland. I did a walk across Scotland maybe 15 years ago now, and I started at an estate called Allerdale, where a guy called Paul List has been trying to reintroduce wolves for decades. And I finished in the south of the Cairngorms in a place called Killiecrankie, where the last wolf in Scotland is meant to have been shot. And I used that walk as a way of talking to people about how they'd feel about having the wolf back in Scotland. So I was speaking with hikers and gamekeepers and shepherds and estate owners, and as you can imagine, it was pretty polarized. From the people that live in the cities that like to go hiking in the Highlands in the weekend think it's probably a great idea, and people that have a bit more skin in the game that are living on the land think it's broadly a terrible idea. So I didn't begin the walk in any way with this idea of, we should have wolves back here, and I want to make a case for that. Um, but yeah, the idea was really to try and sort of approach it with balance and listen to both sides of listen to the people really. One of the things that really drew me to Schlouts, which is the wolf's journey that I followed, was that he'd walked this line through the mountains and through all these people um, who were so often overlooked and had to me the most interesting stories to tell.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, you know, first of all, I've no idea how to pronounce, and when I read it,
Schlouts, it is Schlouts.
Schla-
It's really one of the downfalls of the book is that no one knows how to say his name, which I was kind of hampered by because he's got this Slovenian name, which is what he comes with.
or how to, well, yeah, perhaps we ought to say, how did he get his name, and also what do you think was the cause for him to undertake this sort of solo journey? You know, this incredible journey of 1,000 miles across Europe. What pushed him there, or what pulled him there? So first of all, where did he get his name from?
So he was born in 2010 in the south of Slovenia on a place called Schlaunik Mountain, which is where the name came from, which is this sort of karst limestone landscape in the south of Slovenia. It's this place, really a meeting of borders. It's this amazing region. It's, you know, Italy's 7 miles away in one direction, Croatia's 2 miles away in another direction, and it's on this kind of plateau, which has been this tussle for millennia between different competing groups and different borders, really a kind of meeting place of different worlds, and very much the sort of watershed of Europe as well. Everything to the west drains into the Adriatic, which is about 10 miles away. Everything to the east drains into the Danube and flows off to the Black Sea. So it's this real dividing point in Europe. And Schloss was born there, and the following summer he was collared by Hubert Potocznik, who's this researcher at the University of Ljubljana. And Hubert was right at the beginning of his career at the time, and he was collaring wolves, which is no easy task, by the way, getting a collar on a wolf. They're really very much, anyone that works with large carnivores will tell you that the wolf is the hardest animal to work with, hardest animal to trap. But he was collaring wolves as best he could just to see how they lived within their territories, basically, how they kind of moved and the pack dynamics. But then when he was 18 months old, so about 6 months after he was collared, Schlaus set off on this 1,000-mile walk. He left his pack behind, never returned to his territory again, crossed Slovenia, crossed Austria, and came to Italy. And, you know, it's not completely unusual to behave like that. A lot of, I mean, not only wolves, but other animals as well have this dispersal behavior, and that's really because eventually a pack will outgrow the size of its territory. You know, we have this idea of the alpha wolf.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, is it an alpha male? Or
Well, so this idea of the alpha still persists. It's been completely discredited in the science by now. A wolf pack is not this kind of alpha wolf with all these other males trying to depose him in this kind of harem of females. It's only the sort of more toxic corners of the internet that still like to think in terms of alphas, and I think people have held on to it because we like to think that's how the world works. So a wolf pack is basically a monogamous family unit with a few generations of pups, and they might have different. There might be some other adults enter. Some of the pups might stick around to look after the next litter. It's basically a family. And okay, you know, and given time, that means that the family will outgrow the amount of prey that's available within the territory of the pack. And so a few young males and females will strike out on their own. What's amazing about Schlaus's journey is not only that he went so far, and not only that he had this collar on that allows us to see a whole map of the whole 4 months of his walk, but also that he ended up being so successful, because it's by no means a given that 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 they find a home and find a mate at the end of it.
yeah. Well, I'm wondering, is this a good time for you to read something? You said you've got a kind of foreshortened
Mm,
prologue, and that might
sure.
give people a feel of A, of your writing, and B, of the story itself.
Yeah.
And then
It's
we'll,
worth saying one of the reasons that I wanted to call the book Lone Wolf is because I wanted to challenge that idea of, you know, we like to think of a lone wolf as this sort of Clint Eastwood character kind of riding off into the sunset, doesn't need anyone. And what I realized from following Schloss is actually a lone wolf is the most vulnerable, lost. I mean, lost is the wrong word, but the most vulnerable time of their lives. And really, what a lone wolf is looking for is the same three things that we're all looking for, essentially, which is a place to belong and enough food to eat and a mate. There's no more dangerous time for a wolf. So this is taken, it's a sort of truncated, shortened version of the prologue. But this is taken from the very beginning of the book. It's just sort of 3 or 4 minutes. The wolf left in the winter. The days are short at this time of year, and the nights are very long. There are no birds, and the bare poles of the beeches recede into the darkening wood, push up into the thin metallic sky. The snow down here is grey for lack of light. There is nothing moving, no life, except for him. The wolf moves precisely. Each print that he leaves is the size of a saucer. This wood makes up one stretch of the western boundary of his pack. His other perimeters are many kilometres away. Since dawn, he has scarcely broken pace. He is an animal built for motion. This is, perhaps, his supreme quality. He is not killed for 11 days, but he can go for far longer than that. Beneath his fur, he is taut and lean, but his coat is as thick as it will get all year, and however thin he gets, he will not be cold, not yet, not until he begins to metabolize his muscle. For now, he is only keen and focused. His coat is tan and steel and crow black and snow white, a palette drawn from the colours of the landscape. It is unimaginable that wolves were once gone from this place, because no animal could belong here more completely. His breath clouds in the cold, hard air. He moves across land that is very old. Beside a trunk, he lifts his leg and urinates, and then he paws at the ground to smear the sweat from the apocrine glands between his toes over the snow. This scent narrates his sex and age: a yearling, male, his subspecies, Canis lupus lupus, his social status in his pack, subordinate, his sexual readiness, he is fertile. It gives indications as to his health and diet. To his pack, it is an olfactory fingerprint unique to him. To other wolves, it says keep moving. It says this territory is taken, carry on. Soon he stops to mark again, and then he continues, moving upwards, through the naked wood. He is still young. He is 19 months old, but he will not be young for much longer now. He is full grown, 40 kilos and standing 75 centimetres at the shoulder. Last winter, as a pup, his pack had let him feed. Now there is a new litter to care for, and increasingly, he spends his time alone. He pads on. He follows a concertina of razor wire that maps the curvature of the land. He knows to avoid its blades. He knows the places that are slack where he can cross. This land has seen the redrawing of borders and the movement of its peoples since the beginnings of recorded time and longer, and the wolf cares for none of this. But sometimes a deer will get hung up on the fence, and that is worth something to him. He snaps at a falling leaf, misses it, and surprised by his own silliness, he trots on. The wolf moves across the landscape, and he seems terribly small within it. His species was sharpened on such environments, and honed too by his relationship of persecution with man. In essence, the wolf is a conservative species. He learns through difference. He retains a sharp memory of the trap last summer, his 4 foot clamped and the utter terror, and of later waking, woozy, and the awful human scent on him and the collar awkward around his neck. Sometimes he is still aware of the collar that he wears. He will not make such a mistake again. His brother was shot. He saw it happen. 1/3 of them, at least, die before their first year is out. Already he is a wolf that defies odds. And so it is that on the 19th of December 2011, at just after 3:30 in the morning, he will set foot outside his territory for the first time in his life. He will take a bearing north-northeast, following a logging road along the Bukovica Ridge. 80 kilometres away, in a room on the second floor of the biotechnical faculty in the University of Ljubljana, a GPS point will appear on a computer screen. Did the wolf know, in those first foreign steps, the journey he was embarking on? Was he scared of the newness, the strangeness, the difference? Did he know these were the first steps on a journey of several thousand kilometres, a journey of many months? Did he know, right there at the beginning, that he would never be coming back?
Well, thank you. Thank you for reading that.
Thanks,
And
Andrew.
I think one of the things that I also took from this was you mentioned that wolves and dogs have a kind of link. There's the idea that dogs may have wolves as their ancestors, and I know from walking with dogs, the one thing that they do is they rush around in circles and disappear under bushes and go everywhere. So how did you follow in the footsteps of this wolf? Because I don't believe he walked in a straight line and made a beeline for some territory. So what happened?
I mean, there is a sense that dogs are kind of wolves that haven't grown up yet, that they're sort of stuck in this perpetually arrested sort of juvenile state, which is why they're kind of subservient to us. There's a part of the book where I go to visit this research center where they it's just outside Vienna, and they look at the differences between wolves and dogs, that they raise them in the same way. And the idea is when you control for the nurture, they try and look at the nature of wolves and dogs. And I got really into the weeds of the whole ongoing scientific debate about when and where and how wolves were first domesticated, which is fascinating because they were the very first animal that we domesticated, kind of even before we domesticated ourselves, before we sort of set up houses when we were still hunter-gatherers. We were working with wolves for the first time. It's in some ways the sort of first time that we manipulated nature to do our bidding, and everything else is history. Um, So, and they say when you follow a wolf walks in a complete straight line. I would meet people. I met someone in the park where the wolf ended up who told me that he'd seen a wolf. He'd followed a wolf track in a dead straight line to a wolf kill about four
Oh,
miles
really?
away. Reminding me of those sort of psychogeographers that sort of take a line through a city and crawl through people's windows and stuff, so they don't have to deviate. Whereas if you follow and one wolf following another, it's impossible to tell how many wolves there are because they will walk in each other's footsteps. Whereas, as you say, a dog is more like a child scribbling. Just they're all over the place. But all that said, Schlaus's walk was not entirely in a straight line. There were definitely parts when he would make a kill and he would hang around in an area for days, sort of, and coming back to the kill. There were places, there were lots of dead ends, kind of going to mountain passes and realizing it was particularly heavy snow that winter, getting to places and not being able to cut through. So, I realized quite early on that I wasn't going to be able to physically stand on every single one of the 634 GPS points that he'd left across Europe. It would have taken me. I'd still be walking now. So I decided to do a kind of line of best fit that didn't allow for all those deviations. But it was really interesting. I had all the stack of maps, and before I left, I transferred each of those points onto the maps. And he would make these choices that I couldn't understand, that he'd be heading north for a couple of days and then suddenly he'd shoot off west. But walking it, I'd realized the point where he shot off west was the first time that he could see the airport for certain reasons. Actually, following it on foot allowed me to, however imperfectly, but get a sense of how he might have been seeing the world a little bit better than looking at it on paper.
I mean, the other thing is he would set off at a far faster rate than you'd ever be able to keep up on foot. So, did you know when you started out how long the journey might have taken you?
No, not really. I did it in a few sections in the end because we had a baby back home when I finally set out to do it. The book got delayed a couple of years because of COVID. And so by the time I set out, we had two little kids at home, and so I decided to do it in a few sections and go back each time. Um, so I guess overall, I was walking for maybe kind of 4 or 5 months, but I staggered it over the best part of a year, really, which allowed me to sort of see different areas and different seasons better as well.
And obviously, you didn't walk through the midwinter, which is possibly when Slouch. I hope I'm getting better at this. Slouch might have been doing. He walked. He was definitely walking over Christmas and through the New Year, and therefore in the hardest weather and season that you could find in that part of Europe.
Yeah, and in a particularly heavy snow year, and in Austria, in particularly going up to mountain passes that are sort of 3,500 meters. So yeah, the more that I set out and did the first part of the walk in Slovenia in February, and then sort of stretching into the summer where he walked from December through to March. Um, yeah, and the more that I followed in the footsteps, just the more impressed I was that there was me with my maps and my GPS and my plan and my gas burner for cooking and everything else. The idea that it reminded me of those sort of monks that would cast off in a coracle and just have no idea what was out there. It's that sort of, and especially because Schloss was setting off into a Europe that even 10 years ago had far fewer wolves than we have now. The chances of him finding, and I mean, obviously he didn't know this, but the chances of crossing paths with another wolf, of finding another wolf, of really heading out into the complete uncharted unknown for such a long time was astonishing to me.
Well, maybe you've taken away the punchline at the end of the book. I don't know where you suddenly say, yes, he met, he
So
met.
yes, yeah. So you know, yeah, it's a love story. I mean, and that's one of the many things that drew me to this story in the beginning is it's a love story, which is that when he reached, so he crossed Austria, he came down into Italy through the Dolomites, and then reached this small regional park called Licinia, which is often referred to as the Little Dolomites as well. One of the things that was really interesting to me was that the Little Dolomites, Licinia, felt to me very similar to the place that he set out from. He'd been walking through these big Austrian like granite mountains, lots of spruce, very high. And then in Italy, he came back to another limestone landscape. It was about the same altitude, kind of 1,000, 1,500 meters. Same sort of trees. There were beech trees again, which I hadn't seen for the whole journey. And I could really get this feeling of he'd be like, yeah, you know, I'm home in some sense. This feels familiar. These are the sorts of smells and flora and fauna that I grew up with. Um, it was also pretty good sheep territory, which I'm sure didn't hurt. It's this very kind of traditional farming area still, where people will still send their flocks up into the mountains for the summer. But the most amazing thing is that he bumped into this other wolf. We don't know exactly where she came from because she didn't have a collar on. But from looking at the genetics, it seems likely she probably came from the French-Italian border over in the west. So she'd also been on this incredible journey of several hundred miles. And somehow the only two wolves for thousands of square miles found each other. And there's this beautiful moment in when I was talking to the ranger and when he described their tracks meeting in the snow for the first time, the ranger found this first encounter and how he could see them sort of tumbling over each other, just their pure excitement of, you know, thinking they were the only two wolves left on the planet and they'd found each other. So they found each other. She was rapidly called Juliet by the local press because they were so close to Verona. And
Inevitable.
they bred and they formed the first wolf pack back in the northeast Italian Alps for more than 100 years. And a little bit more than a decade on, there are now about 100 wolves back in the area, which are their descendants, and then other wolves that have kind of drifted in uh, since as well. So it's that legacy which is also so incredible and has really changed, you know, the ecosystem that exists there now as well.
Well, I mean, the other thing that I think we talked about this very briefly before we started the meeting was that one of the things that really drew me into the book was the descriptions of those people who now, you know, who farmed those areas, which are very, you know, they're pretty remote, they're very rugged areas themselves, and of the areas, and the people who live there have been usually through several family generations, you know,
Mhm.
and they've lived that area without wolves, and now they're frequenting a territory which is wolf territory. And I thought it was really interesting how you got to meet these people. How did you make that happen? How, you know, did you just stumble across them, or did you, you know, is there a, you know, association of farmers who work in wolf territory? You know, how's it all done?
Yeah, there's definitely some sort of groups of kind of alpine pastoralist groups. So I'd make contact with people, but then a lot of it, and you know, and this was sort of one of the main reasons to do it as a walk. It wasn't just this sort of nice device to follow in the footsteps of a wolf. But and I'd found this from Alaska as well. The first time I'd been in Alaska was as a journalist, and I'd catch a bush plane into these sort of very remote communities, and I'd find it incredibly hard to get through to people to kind of break down that barrier. But then when I did it as a canoe trip, I suddenly found that it opened up connections to people in a completely different way. You know, people really appreciated that I was taking the time to sort of be in the country with them and spend time on the river and I'd sort of opened up this string of coincidence as well. You know, I'd meet someone and they'd be like, "Well, you have to go and meet my cousin sort of in the next village
Mhm,
down," and
mhm.
then I'd meet the cousin and they'd want to know how the fishing was going upriver. So there was something about doing it as a walk, this one as well, where it allowed me to sort of meet these people and gain the trust of these people in a way that I think it would have been really hard to do if I was doing it, you know, if I was just turning up on my rental car and doing
Yeah,
it.
I think they were pretty stunned actually. I think many of them were
Yeah, I
pretty
think some of them
stunned.
were sort of grudgingly impressed. There was
Yeah.
one guy, Stanley, in the north of Slovenia who got me to meet him in his kind of mountain hut that was about 2,000 meters up a mountain, which I think was very much sort of the challenge to the English
Yeah.
journalist. But when I actually got there, he seemed, yeah, he seemed impressed enough to kind of, and he was lovely. He's one of Slovenia's sort of main anti-carnivore campaigners, and he very much saw me as the wolf's ambassador. But as most people were, he was incredibly hospitable and let me stay the night and then gave me dinner. And, we had a much better connection, I think, than had I just turned up and put a microphone in his face and asked him what he thought.
Now, I tell you, some people have started writing in the chat. Anne Forrest has actually suggested a poem. I'm not suggesting she reads it out, but people might like to look at the chat and read what she's written. But Jeff, do you want to ask a question about what this wolf might have lived on? Are you there, Jeff?
I am here.
Hi, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very long journey, and I don't know whether it's a sort of wildlife cliche that wolves hunt in packs. I mean, that's what I've always seen on sort of wildlife films. So it's just difficult to imagine how the wolf managed that journey of so many sort of 100 or 1,000 kilometres without the ability to sort of run down a deer or whatever the case may be. So just intrigued about how it made the journey. Was it just sort of feeding on scraps or occasionally trapping a squirrel, that sort of thing?
Yeah, you're right that they hunt much better in packs, and it's one of the reasons that doing this journey as a lone wolf is such a vulnerable time for them, because they are reduced pretty much to hunting things like you say, like foxes. There's actually a very detailed, and I have this as a map of the several maps in the book, and I've marked on every single kill that he made on the journey, because Hubert, who was watching the wolf's journey, he could tell when he made a kill because the wolf would stay in the area for 2 or 3 data points. And so then when the wolf moved on, Hubert and his team would go to those locations and find the carcass. So they were able to see every single kill that he made as he made his way across Europe. So yeah, there were foxes. There was the occasional roe deer, which he was fairly fully grown by then. So a roe deer is not enormous compared to a red deer. And then he got a taste when he got to Italy. He got a taste for goats, and then most amazingly, he found a horse in Licinia that he was able to drive off a cliff, and then go down and scavenge the carcass at the bottom.
My other comment is that it would really make an excellent Disney film, and after hearing you say that, I'm reinforcing that point. No, tongue in cheek, obviously.
I think there's a lot of yeah. I think there's interesting ways to tell this story that haven't been done yet for sure.
Okay, so we've got a couple of other nature writers who've put little comments in the chat. So the first is Polly Atkin. Polly, you said how important it was about wolf social groups work. Do you want to say anything more?
Yeah, I was just saying, it's such a lovely book, and it was so lovely to hear you read some of that, Adam, as well. I've been in different Zoom meetings for like the last 2 hours, so I am a bit tired, but it properly made me like well up hearing you read it, because it's such an emotional piece of writing, which I think possibly Chantal has a question about in a different way. But I think one of the things that I love about it is how it does make you think differently about those social groups and those myths that we have about the wolf versus what wolves are actually doing. And I guess you can tell through the book that that is really important to you. But how much of that did you want to get through in the writing, and how did you balance that with telling his individual story as well?
I think first and foremost to me, it was about trying to get all those conflicting points of view in. And the more that I saw the anger in the countryside, and what's happening, and how that anger is being used as well. One of the things I really hadn't expected was, particularly in Austria, far-right politicians in the countryside are very much using the fear of the wolf and are scapegoating the wolf as this way of kind of chasing the rural vote in this. Partly because the wolf is protected by the EU. It's a very short distance from having a problem with the wolf to having a problem with the EU. And I found local leaders kind of, rather than encouraging farmers to take the sort of necessary coexistence measures, which can work, actually encouraging them not to do that, to allow the disasters to happen in order to, you know, as the sort of real populist playbook. And, you know, in many ways, it's that kind of impotence that the farmers are feeling at the moment that is driving a lot of that anger, and just being told by Brussels or by people that live in cities that they're wrong, you know, and we can learn to live with this, doesn't seem, you know, it's not going to be a solution. And it's the main reason that I would not back a kind of wolf reintroduction to the UK at the moment, because I feel like we haven't had those conversations. And that's only going to do a disservice not only to the people that are living on the land that have, you know, most of the skin in the game, but it's also going to do a disservice to the wolves, because the places where wolves are not accepted, they are being shot and poisoned and everything else. And so without taking time to listen to those voices, and, you know, I found this walk when I first did my walk across Scotland, the word rewilding is, I found in Scotland, people here as a kind of continuation of the clearances. You know, it's this sense, this is just the next thing. It used to be sheep, now it's wolves, but basically it's about getting rid of people that are living on the land. And it's been so badly managed, a lot of the rewilding work that's been done in the UK, that it's really turned a lot of the people that should be backing this stuff against it. And I think it's, you know, it's only by taking time to listen to those people and hear those people and work with those people that we could actually, you know, I'd love to see wolves back here, but not now, not like this.
Okay, great, thanks. And Chantal, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Sorry, Adam, my train was late, so I didn't get to the start of this. But so I loved the book, and I thought it was brilliant that you sprinkled mini narratives of what Slaus might have been seeing, might have been feeling and experiencing on his journey. Did you always want to include those snippets in the book? Did you? And I'm also curious to know if you had, I mean, was your editor or anyone involved in the book's production sort of like, are you sure you want to do this? I mean, I don't know. It maybe they were all like, yeah, this is great, we love it, which is great. But I'm really interested in it because it is something, you know, I would love to see more of this, and I don't think we see enough of it, you know, experimenting with humbly imagining how it might have been for this character, for this animal.
Yeah, I was probably the most reluctant, actually, to start with. I was definitely the most nervous. I had this idea that it would be nice to do, and I felt like I'd kind of earned the privilege of being allowed to have a go. There was a moment right at the beginning of the walk when Hubert took me to the den that Schlautz was born in, and I could it was on the limestone, so there's all these crevices and holes in the limestone, and the den was a few meters below the surface, so I just sort of crawled down into this den, and standing there was this amazingly intimate moment of knowing where this wolf was and that I was going to be following this wolf. It was a sort of, I could understand why people like Hubert, the biologist, do the jobs that they do, because you get for a moment to sort of step across that threshold, and even though it's really clumsy, you get a bit of a better sense than I normally have of how a wild animal might be feeling. And I felt that having done this journey, I could at least have a go at trying to write a couple of sections like that. And, you know, not in the first, I was very clear I wasn't going to do it in the first person. That would have felt too much. And I read, I'm sure some of you will know Barry Lopez's Of Wolves and Men. And there's a beautiful introductory section in that where, again, he writes very sort of, it's very descriptive and scientific, but he's very close to the wolves when he's writing about them. Yeah, and I'm intrigued by those stories. I think you need the human characters. I think it's really hard to make anyone care about a wolf for 300 pages. You know, I just don't think we can, most of us can't emotionally connect to something that's not people for that much. But I was yeah, I was interested to try and, you know, and if you think of something like Richard Powers' The Overstory, right, that, you know, it's about the people, but it's very up close to the trees. And I'm interested how we can, yeah, just try and create those emotional connections.
That's great. Martin Howe, you have a question to ask too.
Yes, hi Adam. Yeah, no, I was really fascinated, by this journey and the sort of parallels between, what a wolf would do and what a human would do in some ways, and to what extent this is nature and nurture. It's quite a young animal, and it's just gone on. It hasn't been taught anything really, or it might have been taught some basics, but to what extent it's having to learn as it goes. And to my mind, there's a parallel with human nature, in that we explore, we climb mountains, we try to learn things, discover things, and we're adventurous, or some people are adventurous. My wife actually introduced me to this book because she says my shadow self is a lone wolf. So it's a bit of a joke, but yeah, it's because I'm a long distance walker and I spend a lot of time going on long journeys. And so she ordered the book and presented it to me as but then I realized it was actually a very fascinating story. But I'm interested in this nature nurture discussion, and particularly to try and visualize, how this wonderful animal has survived and has gone on this journey and it has gone on to generate another generation, for the species to survive, not only himself but the species. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, definitely this wolf, and this was where it's quite, and this is why I'm not a scientist, because I like to ask those sorts of questions as well. And when I'd ask Hubert about kind of this wolf's individual personality or why he was so successful compared to others, it's the sort of things where scientists can get a bit uncomfortable. Or definitely when I said it, when I told Hubert it was a love story, I could really see him kind of like, oh. But I think there are certain things you can suggest in Schlautz's biography that may have made him more successful. He grew up in a territory that had a highway going right through it, so he would have been more used about finding the ways to cross a highway, finding the culverts that go under it, than other wolves. He would have been more used to sort of human infrastructure and human noise than other wolves. So there were certain things that might have made him both a bit bolder and a bit more canny around other people, around people. And I think your point about human movement is absolutely true as well. I think we are migrators. That is what it is. That's what human nature is. And one of the things that really drew me to this story in the first place was that overlap with, well, there were two things. One is that I myself walked from England to Istanbul 15 years ago now. And I'd already done a kind of long journey on foot across Europe myself. And so I felt a bit of an affinity with the wolf in that sense. And then also when I was first researching the book, I was living on Lesbos. My wife was working in the refugee camp on Lesbos. And the place where the wolf arrived was in Lycinia, where a lot of refugees were also being settled in this disused NATO barracks right up in the mountains. And a lot of the language that was being used by the local people about the wolves and the refugees arriving was very similar. They're not from here. We were here first. I don't have a problem with them, but this isn't their place. And the way that both the wolf and the refugee were both being scapegoated, and in particular that many refugees that were meeting in Greece were heading off on these long foot journeys through the Balkans into Italy, very similar journeys that Schlauss had made. That overlap between, how the wolf and the refugee were being scapegoated, but also how instinctive and natural it was in some ways to move in order to seek a better life. Yeah, and those overlaps felt very apparent to me sort of the whole way through the book.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't read the book yet, but it literally is on the table waiting to be read. So I look forward to it. Thank you.
Right.
Okay, we're sort of getting close to the time when we need to pitch in and run the multiple choice quiz. And we run the quiz, and we're making a bold assumption that Adam doesn't want to win his own book. So, but then again, who knows? He might want to take part. He's not seen the questions, so who knows? But actually, I want to make sure Adam gets the last word. So he's going to have the last word after the quiz.
Okay.
But I've got one more question that I'd like to ask, because Adam, I think one of the things that I found kind of quite interesting or intriguing was I felt it took you about 100 pages before you started actually revealing something about yourself. And something you wrote was you have this is quote, a longing for something you have never ever known. So could you expand on that a little? And since following Slouch, has your longing diminished, been satiated, or are you still longing?
And the first draft of both of my books has come back saying we need more of you in it. And it's something that I think I'm always reluctant to put too much of myself in it, because I really want to avoid it being one of these sort of man versus nature sort of, this is, look at the brilliant thing I did. But I'm also aware that not putting myself in it, in some ways you sort of end up like that kind of Victorian anthropologist who thinks that they can sort of go anywhere and they're not affecting where they are and they're not affected by it. And obviously that's not true either. So it always feels like this balance. The bit that Andrew's talking about, I think, is, you know, a lot of these. So I've got two little kids now, 7 and 5, and a lot of these farmers that I was meeting were living these amazing, or what seemed to me as a sort of, as a tourist, amazing lives up in the mountains, you know, in like beautiful old farmhouses and living on the land and carrying on local traditions and drinking their own milk, and, you know. So I think there was a constant question for me during the book of how, you know, in the moment I live in a town on the sea in Kent, and actually how do I want to raise my kids, and where do I want to settle, and how much of this is sort of romanticizing the countryside, and how much and romanticizing the wolf as well. You know, these are sort of living, working places, and I'm not going to pretend that people aren't. You know, it's an incredibly hard life that farmers are living at the moment, and it's not just carnivores being back. It's climate change, and it's the escalating cost of energy, and it's the fact that young people don't want to farm anymore. You know, these are tough lives in tough places. So yeah, there was a question for me, as I guess in all the journeys that I do, about how much I'm romanticizing these places and how much I'm seeing them for as they are. And if I'm going to take my kids off to a Slovenian farmhouse, probably not.
All right. Well, look, thanks, Adam. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, because you obviously find it kind of little difficult to write about yourself, and also not so easy to talk about it. But brilliant, Adam. You have the last word. But thank you very much. I should say thank you very much for writing the book. Thank you for coming along as our Salon guest.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really nice. I don't think I've done one of these since the pandemic, to be honest. And I did have a certain sort of flashback for a moment of sitting on another Zoom call with lots of people, but this has been a lot more fun than that. So yeah, thank you for having me. It seems like a really nice crowd.
But thanks to everyone for coming along. A big thank you to Adam, and everyone enjoy the evening.